All right, YouTube, there are more Christian tears being shed right now because of the state of Michigan striking down the voter-approved ban on gay marriage there. So now, and apparently most of the people in the state don't want to bother appealing the decision. So gay marriage is now legal in Michigan fully. I'm assuming that somebody might try to appeal it, but it's sort of a lost issue at this point, especially in Michigan, which leans blue anyway. There's not as much moralism going on in that state. It's like the other Great Lakes states, Wisconsin and so forth, where things have gone more towards the left in recent years, whereas before they were at least marginally, they were swing states. Um, First, the federal judge in question that ruled this ban unconstitutional. This is really upsetting the Christians, by the way, this particular facet of this, was a Reagan appointee, a conservative president's federal judge appointee. So the idea is, in the past, people have said, especially about Texas and Utah, that it was essentially liberal federal judges that had gotten in there that were attempting to legislate from the bench, that they were appointed by people like Obama or whatever. And that's why they ruled that way. This brings a different point to the debate, that this is a Reagan appointee. He was put there by Ronald Reagan, who's sort of the poster child of the neoconservatives, beloved by even the modern evangelicals, although, let's face it, Reagan probably wasn't nearly as religious as he proclaimed in public. Just like Bush, he used it to get votes and probably didn't care. However, the fact that this federal judge was a Reagan appointee really strips the zealot evangelicals of one of their main lines of attack, which is, oh, leftist activist judges. Well, Reagan is not known for having appointed particularly liberal individuals to the bench, so that argument sort of falls flat. In fact, and I believe this is the 23rd state, if I remember correctly now, that has legalized gay marriage, including the ones where it's pending appeal. So we're fast approaching that magical 25-state tipping point. The majority of the U.S. population already supports gay marriage. That becomes a minority in some particularly religious states in the Deep South and parts of the Midwest, but it's slowly swinging in that direction. Among the youth, it's overwhelming. I think it's something like 78% of people who are under 25 support gay marriage, and it's not much smaller among 20 and 30-somethings. Whereas only now the elderly people primarily are under 50% as far as supporting gay marriage, and these people are slowly dying off. So, within 20 years, certainly it will be federally legal. I would say probably within the next year or two, and that's my prediction. The lines of attack used by evangelicals, not even, a lot of people say, well, the damn GOP is trying to squish out gay rights. No, it's not the GOP mainstream that is doing this. People like Bush, when they proposed anti-gay legislation, did that for votes, because they realized that about half of the members of the GOP are evangelical individuals. It has nothing to do with their own personal values. You think Mitt Romney or George W. Bush cared about this issue? If you believe that, I have swampland in Florida for sale, very cheap. These individuals do not care if gays get married. In fact, probably some of these people themselves are gay or bisexual. People who talk about Bohemian Grove all the time, even Nixon himself called it, quote-unquote, the faggiest thing he had ever seen, and saw people apparently pissing on trees and doing all sorts of various sexual acts. And there are plenty of Republicans, including Nixon, in this group. That's a little bit of conspiracy material, but the main line of attack used by evangelicals falls into several categories, each of which is easy to debunk. The first is sexual acts of a homosexual nature are unnatural. They may or may not say abomination because of the moral proclivity that they have, but usually they say biologically it's just abnormal. They overlook straight couples that have anal or oral sex, often as a form of birth control, ironically, which is also technically unnatural, biologically speaking. Birth control is actually falls into that same category. They overlook the straight couples that do the same thing. They're also overlooking the Supreme Court has already ruled on anti-sodomy laws, found them to be unconstitutional, and struck them down. In states where anti-sodomy laws persist, they are not enforced because they're unenforceable and unconstitutional. They simply remain on the books. Sort of as a reminder, these states essentially will leave them on the books as an example to say we're kind of vaguely protesting this decision. We realize we can't enforce these laws, but they're going to stay on the books so that people can see them, and it shows that our state stands up for good Christian morality, which doesn't even involve most of the things that they talk about when they talk about gay marriage. Most of these arguments wouldn't have even been known to early Christians if they would have been debated at all. So that argument sort of falls apart. They might also say, well, it's a mental illness or something along those lines. Well, the same medical community around the same time period that was proclaiming homosexuality to be a sort of aberrance or disease also originally proclaimed that AIDS was only transferable through homosexual contact. I actually have read a medical book from the early 1990s that openly proclaims that AIDS is specifically transferred by homosexual sexual acts. It says nothing about straight sexual acts because originally they thought straight sex couldn't lead to AIDS. They didn't realize it could be transferred through semen and so forth. They thought it was transferred specifically, most of the time, through anal sex because of their reigning ideas at the time. This is not the case, just as now the modern psychiatric community does not label being gay to be a particular mental illness. I will give them one little bit of leeway and say there are probably certain individuals who do manifest homosexuality as an offshoot of some underlying disorder, just the way that they may exhibit some other sexual proclivity as an offshoot of their disorder. But that doesn't mean that everyone that has that proclivity is mentally ill. Most of them probably are not. It's just like people who are into various fetishes. Well, they could just be something that turns a person on. It could just be the natural state of their sexuality. Or it could be some sort of obsessive thing that is a compulsion and is going to lead to a diagnosis. Just as I am sure, and in time I believe I will be proven right about this, I believe that there are homosexual individuals that are actually exhibiting a straight lifestyle because of their own underlying disorders, that they've been traumatized in some way and actually swung away from being homosexual. It works both ways in any case. I'm sure it'll be unpopular to say this at this time, but in the future I believe that will be recognized as true. Sexuality is much more complicated than most people believe. It's much more complicated than Freudian psychology and sort of the phallic symbol sort of bullshit. It's more complicated than simply gay and straight. It's more complicated than it's either acceptable or aberrant in some way. And it's wholly separate from moralism. That is my belief. I believe that primarily people will have their own natural sexualities, and it is only labeled a disorder or a problem or aberrance or morally despicable or one of these things because of the culture they happen to be in at the specific time that they are alive. Homosexuality would not have been frowned upon in ancient Greece. In ancient Rome, not necessarily would it be lauded, but it would have been tolerated in most cases. These ancient Egypt, look at the ancient Egypt, the royal lineages of ancient Egypt most often married brothers and sisters because they wanted to keep the noble bloodline pure. And if there was no brother or sister, then it was a cousin or something like that. You have all of these different sexual things throughout human history. It's bizarre to label any specific type of marriage or romantic relationship style as normal versus abnormal. I realize that this is moral subjectivity. And I'm not a multiculturalist. I do believe that the United States should adopt a more or less innate culture and impose its morality on its own citizenry. However, that should be based on the Constitution, and that brings us to another point that the Christians make. Well, you're destroying the First Amendment rights of the church. Well, banning gay marriage technically violates the First Amendment rights of two Christian groups, the Unitarians and the Episcopals, who already bless gay marriage, who already perform gay marriage where it's legal. Technically, if you were to ban gay marriage, it would violate their First Amendment rights. So it negates any claim that these other churches are making that somehow, because gay marriage exists, which is a state contract, by the way, it's not talking about religious ceremonialism, violates their First Amendment rights. The ultimate question at hand, and this defeats all of the Christian arguments, I believe, on the subject, is simply looking at the 14th, well, looking at the Fourth Amendment too, but the 14th in particular. Does the state have the right to tell private individuals that they are not able to get this particular state contract? It's supplied by the government, by the state and federal government. It has nothing to do with a religious edifice whatsoever. Marriage is a state contract. It pertains to things like property, to your estate, to medical decision-making. It has nothing whatsoever innately to do with a religious ceremony at all. It is a state contract. Does the state government, therefore, have the right to deny to consenting adults access to this contract on a moral basis? The answer is no. And when this hits the Supreme Court, I believe that is how they rule. In fact, I know that's how they'll rule. They'll say no, the states don't have the right to deny to consenting individuals a state contract. Does a religious edifice have the right to deny people a religious, ritualistic, ceremonial marriage? Yes, clearly under the First Amendment. No church is going to be forced to perform gay marriages. Some already do. Like I said, the Unitarian and Episcopal churches have no problem marrying gay couples. There are other various faiths. There are pagan groups and so forth that already perform gay marriages also. Satanism has no problem with gay marriages. Early on it did, but now it's sort of modernized and no longer cares on the subject. In other words, in order to use a moral argument, essentially traditional marriage, abomination, any of these things, to sort of thwart the gay rights movement, you have to assume that the state has the right to adopt a specific religious stance over others as its acceptable stance and use that as a basis for legislation. The same argument was made during the Civil Rights era. The exact same arguments that I see right now, I can look back through stuff from the 50s and 60s that's literally uploaded to YouTube, and I can say these people are making the same arguments. I can literally see it now. The same moralist arguments that are being made were already made many decades ago and continued to be made at least through the 1990s by some of these same latter-day individuals as a reason why segregation should be considered, acceptable. Well, even if you're racist, and you don't like black, or you don't like white people. Louis Farrakhan was the same way, and he was a black nationalist. If you are a racist individual, you can think that all you want, but simply on the basis of the Constitution, which is the highest law of the land of the United States, no, you don't have the right to segregate individuals. And you certainly don't have the right to deny them what is essentially simply a state contract. A state marriage and a religious marriage ceremony are not the same thing. No, literally, nobody with any credibility and understanding of the First Amendment has suggested that religious edifices be forced to perform gay marriages. I myself would completely oppose any such legislation on the basis that it is unconstitutional. Congress can't make that sort of law pertaining to a religious edifice, forcing them to perform that specific type of ritualized marriage. If there are Christians who are gay, and they do exist, I would suggest that they should leave the Christian church because the Christian church is full of hatred and vile bigotry. But if there are gay Christians, they are free to go to an Episcopal church and get married. They can go to a Unitarian church and get married. There are other churches now within Christendom that have started to lean away from fighting gay marriage and are now either silent on the issue and they sort of throw their hands up and say we don't care, or they're sort of leaning towards saying, well, we can tolerate this, I guess. I guess it's not that much of a sin, or I guess it's not really a sin, or I guess even if it is a sin, we put America before, the Bible, some of these Americana sort of groups that spawned in the United States to begin with. But literally every argument that's being made right now has to do with some aberrant biology or psychology, which is completely blown out of the water because there are straight couples that do these same-sex acts. And the psychiatric community, even if you assume it's been bought and paid for by the homosexual lobby, like all of these evangelicals claim, it's still there. That's still their professional rendering. These same people, by the way, these same evangelicals, particularly the sort of tinfoil hat ones, have said for years now, well, eventually they're going to label religion a mental illness. Well, if you're afraid of that, then it would make sense to stop fighting against them repealing their sort of view of being gay as some sort of mental illness, as a precursor to then declaring your religion as some sort of mental illness. By the way, that's never actually going to happen. There are way too many religious people in the United States for it to happen, of various religions, not just Christianity. There are other religious groups, again, that don't have a problem with gay individuals. There are other arguments that they use too. The First Amendment. Well, the First Amendment gives us... here's the big one, actually. Big one is majority rules. Well, the majority in this state already voted to ban gay marriage. Again, the 14th Amendment overrides the democratic process. People can't vote away the constitutional rights of others. This boils down to simply a constitutional argument. People on the evangelical side are trying to make it seem like this is some sort of death struggle between the federal and state government. Essentially, the states have already banned it. The federal government's using activist judges to undermine our state power. But the states have already attempted to use subversive democratic action to undermine the ability of minority individuals within their states. The federal government is simply stepping in and affirming the rights of these minority groups, as it did during the Civil Rights era. Think of it what you will, that's still what the Constitution concludes. That's the reason anti-sodomy laws were already struck down. And here's why I predict with 100% certainty that when the Supreme Court hears these cases, it will uphold gay marriage and wipe out all of these state bans, even if there are still some remaining at the time that some of these cases hit the Supreme Court. Here's why I know this. Because they already weighed in on anti-sodomy laws back before the court was as left as it is now. It was more conservative than it is now, back when that issue was ruled on. And they overruled the sodomy laws. The reasoning being the government doesn't have the right to dictate to these specific individuals what they can do in the privacy of their own home sexually if they're consenting adults, because it's protected by the Constitution. They're going to use the same reasoning, only with a different amendment, for the gay marriage issue. They're going to say the 14th Amendment, clearly, protects individuals who wish to obtain this state contract. It is a secular, non-religious, has nothing to do with ceremonialism contract. The state has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that there is a specific rationale behind this discrimination that doesn't involve religious moralism, because, again, First Amendment precludes that religious moralism from influencing secular law, and that there's some reason behind it of there's either a necessity behind it or at least some non-religious, non-moralist reason why it should be acceptable. And so far, no federal judge in which these cases have been brought forth recently has found in their favor. So far, all of them have said these states have fallen short on their goal of proving that it's either necessary or at least proper. And it will be found the same way at the Supreme Court. As soon as these cases hit the Supreme Court, which could be this year or could be next, the Supreme Court is most likely to wipe out all bans at once. At the very least, they will uphold the decisions of all of these federal judges, and gay marriage will remain illegal in only a handful of states. That will slowly dwindle away over time, and eventually maybe the Supreme Court will then make its more blanket ruling on the subject. But that's my prediction. It will rule in favor of gay marriage. Anyone who's the evangelicals who remain optimistic and say, well, the Supreme Court certainly can't be that corrupt, you're wasting your time. Even if the Supreme Court was composed of 9 people put there by Reagan and Bush and was utterly conservative, they would still, if they're interpreting the Constitution properly, apply the 14th Amendment to the issue. And they do not care about your moralism. These are professional, and regardless of whether they are left or right, their primary job is to interpret the Constitution and to apply it to laws and to render their rulings thusly. It has nothing to do with their religion. Even if they happen to be religious individuals, I believe that they will find in favor of gay marriage. But I'm drinking Christian tears, as always, over the Michigan issue. Even if I was myself a homophobe, I would still detest evangelical sort of theocratic leanings more because it's a grave danger to the Constitution, just as I see progressivism as a similar danger on the other side. And I would still be laughing at the evangelicals because they make no sense. They don't have any comprehension of the 14th Amendment. They don't even have a comprehension of the First Amendment. So anyone who supports the Constitution, who supports the founding ethos of this country, has to look at these people in wide-eyed wonder and ask, what on earth are you thinking? If you honestly apply yourself and are successful at chipping away at the 14th Amendment, that gives the other side perfect go-ahead to chip away at the Second Amendment, which is what you people are always complaining that they're trying to do. You will set a legal precedent which is against you in the future. These people are crazy if they do not see this. When you remove part of the Constitution, you subject it all to the same level of scrutiny, to the same lowered level of expectation of protection under the law. Because the same Constitution, the same papers that protect your right to keep and bear arms, which is so dear to the right wing in this country, also protects gay individuals to obtain this state contract, which again has absolutely nothing to do with your Baptist or Pentecostal church. Nobody is going to force you to perform gay marriages in your Baptist and Pentecostal churches any more than this same Constitution would allow them to attempt to confiscate your weapons. And if it comes time in the future that the government honestly applies itself to doing so, I'll be on your side on that issue because I've read the Second Amendment. But right now I have to side with the left wing because they are the ones that have an accurate rendition of what the 14th Amendment means. And I support the entire Constitution. I don't just support half of it because I happen to be a member of one of these bloated, corrupt parties. Because just as the right wing is correct on the Second Amendment, fully correct, I believe, the left wing is correct on the 14th and its application to gay rights. That's about all.